Okay, I'm gonna open up the prayer here and we can say this together. Those of you at home, I think you should be able to see it on the Zoom. So let's say this prayer together. Let me, before we start, a reminder, turn your cell phones off or put them on silent. Just kind of do a double check on that, because when that happens, we think somebody's calling. Usually they are. Okay, let's say our prayer together. Glory be to the Father, who by his almighty power and love created me in his image and likeness. Glory be to the Son,
through in whom is incarnation became man,
so that
I can become God.
Glory be
To the Holy Spirit,
who
recognizes me in the Son, and makes
me
me a partaker of his divine nature.
Nature.
Glory be to the holy, undivided Trinity, now and forever. Amen.
Okay, so I'll put, gonna put the group on mute here, but you can always unmute yourself and join in the conversation. And we are kind of always looking for a place to start and let the Holy Spirit lead us a little bit. Happy to see some of you again who I haven't seen in a while. So I think we have a nice group. Let's see, 7 of us here in the dining room.
I just wanted to share an observation from this past week's readings, where it was talking about the wheat and the chaff would be burned away. And it just reminded me of how often we talk about, our own pride and not letting go of things, and how in the end, when the pain of holding on becomes greater than the pain of letting go, then we will let go. And it just brought to mind that whole dialogue, and I had never heard the verse in that term before, and was thinking about my own chaff that needed to be burned away.
So that was just an observation rather than a question or a comment. Does that lead to other thoughts for you, or other questions for you?
It really
Does it
did
result in hope? Does it result in?
No, it led me to a greater understanding of my own difficulties, and that those really are self-inflicted difficulties, and that the pain that's associated with going through them and coming out the other side, and making sure that I stay close to God during that whole time, it totally teaches me how to understand it and how to do it, and leaning into him more closely, that really is part of what is written, is that I'm going to have the chaff burned away, and that burning is probably going to result in my feeling pain.
And okay, that's good.
I can identify with that.
Yeah, because you have a lot of pain too, or?
Well, I had some chaff to burn away.
Oh, chaff to burn away, yeah. So I suppose all of us have chaff to burn away, huh? Yeah, still kind of feeling for a thread here. So chaff to burn away. Our God is a consuming fire, so you have nothing to worry about. When you see God, all the chaff will burn away automatically, and it will just probably be a pretty painful process. And I guess that's why we call it purgatory. So there is a purification that has to take place. And, it's like God finding us is like a craftsman or a person finding a piece of beautiful furniture or beautiful object that's been tarnished and damaged and maybe even broken. There's a great practice they have in Japan. The Japanese word for it is escaping me at the moment, but where they find usually a broken urn or a broken vase of some kind, and and they gather all the little shards and pieces and they put it back together. And I think they fill the cracks with gold or something that reflects gold. And then when they restore it to its original beauty, they keep the lines where it was broken show up in the second firing of it and the second reglazing of it. And I'm not describing the process obviously very well, but you get the point.
We understand.
And so it shines with a new kind of glory, but the broken parts of it are still visible. And you could say in a certain sense that the outlines of the wounds of the brokenness of the object in a certain sense enhances its beauty. You know, it certainly makes it more arresting to the vision. And I think when Christ appeared to his apostles after he rose from the dead, he appeared in glory as the one who had been crucified. So he shows them his wounds, right? And there's light coming out from his wounds. And that's obviously an image that God restores things to glory. God restores all things to glory. At the same time, it's not like, and now I guess we get into the actual, whatever direction we're going in here today, we'll figure it out. What I'm trying to say is, as you've heard me say, and Jessie was sharing a dream that she had earlier about her mother bringing in more dogs and cats. That's more of a nightmare than a dream. So, but I had a dream also last night that I was at some kind of retreat or conference. There were I don't know if there were other priests in the room or other ministers in the room or other professors in the room. It was some sort of quasi-professional gathering. And I was sitting at the back of the room. And I don't know what the occasion was that I felt compelled to speak up, but I spoke up from the bottom of the room. I woke up hearing myself talking, so I was speaking in this dream. But what I was really telling them was that I am a unapologetic advocate of what's called Christian universalism, that all shall be saved. And in this dream, I was trying to lay out to them why I thought this was the case. And I think the last thing that I said to them was, if that's not the case, then we shouldn't call the gospel good news. And we shouldn't call the New Testament new, because it has nothing to add. If it's just a rewarming of the Old Testament and whatever those parables about the sheep and the goats mean, if it's no improvement on, the Old Testament slaying the enemies of God and Israel hoping for its redemption at the expense of the other, then really it's not worth believing in to begin with, or we should all go back to being Jews. So what makes Christian? Anyway, I was starting to explain this and they were all cheering. They said, yeah, they were all in agreement. And then I woke up this morning thinking, I allude to this topic very often, but I never take you through the actual steps to get there and show you why the Christian world is divided on this topic and how it falls out. And I've hesitated to do that, and I hesitate to do it again today, even though I printed out my cheat sheet on how this is possible. I made some notes for myself. So what I've done is there's a big scholarly debate about will all be saved? What does hell mean? Does hell really mean, as many scholars argue, that the word hell, there is actually no word hell in the New Testament. It's always the fires of Hinnom, which is a garbage heap over on the east side of Jerusalem where they threw the garbage. And dead bodies sometimes, and it is true that it was always smoldering. So there were always worms. The worm never dies, and the fire never ceases. So everybody knew what Jesus was talking about. He was pointing to this trash heap as a metaphor for people's spiritual condition, essentially. Okay, And as you've heard me say many times in these gatherings, when he did point to the trash heap and said, if you don't change, you're going to end up like that, he wasn't threatening them with eternal damnation. He was doing to them what Charles Dickens was trying to do in the Christmas Carol by sending Scrooge a dream of Marley, who had made hell by himself link by link. And Marley was saying, this is you if you don't change your life. And so the visions of hell are always given, whether in Charles Dickens or the gospel, the visions of hell or Fatima, let's say. We talked about that a little bit last week. How are we to interpret the visions of Fatima? All the visions of hell that are given to private seers or in the gospels are always given for the purpose of awakening a person from that condition. So even in telling stories about hell, Christ's intent is never to predict that people are going there. He's telling them to give them a 2x4 across the head because nothing else is working. You know, what you can't get with honey, you have to sometimes get with vinegar. If you can't get it with the carrot, you have to get it with the stick for some people. So you know, the theory of purgatory is that you get as much suffering as you need to get through the consequences of your bad behavior. Bad behavior is not offensive to God. It's a violation of the beautiful object that God created. It's a destruction of what God loves. So the sins hurt us. They don't hurt God. They hurt God in the sense that a mother's heart goes out when she sees, and this is a dim human analogy, obviously, but as a mother gets hurt when she sees her children hurting herself, it's not like what the children are doing to hurt themselves are alienating the mother from the daughter. If they're doing anything, they're drawing the mother closer to her, even though the mother might be pulling her hair out and saying, what the heck are you doing here? And might even get mad. Now, this is a dim human analogy to God because he doesn't have those eruptions of human frustration that we have. He doesn't experience that, but he may experience a kind of divine grief. I mean, at least in his incarnate form, when Jesus, you know, said to the Pharisees, woe to you, he wasn't saying, woe, now I'm really going to bring the hammer down on you. That's not what the woes are. The woes are cries of grief. How can you do this to yourself? Can't you see what you're doing? It pains me so greatly to see you so hard-hearted. Okay, all that being said. Now, if you want me to go, the reason I've hesitated going through the arguments or the rationale for the universalism that I'm an unapologetic advocate of is because it sounds too much like a class, and we're not here to do a class. And I, you know, I've kind of moved on in my life from being a classroom teacher to being a gathering facilitator, I guess we might call it. But it is, you know, I'm very tempted to do it because I don't want to be coy by saying, oh, there are these reasons out this for it, but I never show them to you. Okay. By the same token, I don't want this gathering to devolve into a classroom situation. So I may pull out my sheet, I may not, we'll see what happens. But it comes back to the Japanese restored bowl that I was telling you about, and the purpose of hell and the purpose of purgatory. Now, as I said before, the early church's notion of the fires of Gehenna were always they were the equivalent of what we in the Catholic tradition have always talked about as purgatory. They are purgative. They are purifying. They are, in other words, they are remedial. They are restorative. They're not there. Their purpose is not to inflict pain, even though they are painful. Okay, the cup going through the kiln again to be refashioned into its original goodness experiences the fire of the kiln. So there is a pain involved, but the pain comes from a love that is also a consuming fire. So the fire for those who have been in the fire, meaning the fire of love. So take the mystery of fire. And John of the Cross, always, whose feast day was yesterday, thank you, God. John of the Cross compared the divinized soul, or the soul that was in perfect union with God. He compared it to a wet log that is put in a roaring fire. When it's first put in, and he compares this to, and he calls this part of the spiritual life, it's where everybody starts off in their life. It's like a wet log. Imagine yourself as a wet log. You're green, you're wet,
Sizzles.
and you put it in the fire, okay? And so it's not only does it sizzle, but it smokes and it burns and it throws soot everywhere, and it's as messy as it gets. And when you see the mess, there's a temptation to pull it out, to stop the mess. Okay. And he says that's what happens with most people. They find the spiritual life a little bit daunting. So they say, oh boy, I'm making a mess of this. I'm just going to get out altogether. So they do. But he says, if you stay in there long enough, and he said, metaphorically, you can imagine that the log is feeling some pain here, even though logs can't feel pain, but imagine yourself. So imagine the log situation or the Valley of Hinnom as a metaphor for your life, for your interior life in God. So there's spitting and sputting and smoking and just horrific odors, maybe even. But if it stays in there long enough, that the smoke goes away, and then it burns and gives off warmth. And if it stays in there, so it goes through that phase, kind of the green, smoky, smoldering stage, and then into a more of a, you can still see it as wood in there, but there comes a point, John of the Cross says, where the log actually becomes incandescent. We say that it becomes white hot. So there, the fire has penetrated into the center of the log. And you can no longer distinguish what's log and what's fire. It's aglow with the fire. So the fire and the log are one, even though they are distinct. And that's always the mystery, both of the Trinity and of the person in union with God. And actually the person, any created person, is one with God. The fire and the person are one. God is love, and persons are created in love, and persons in their essence are love. So we are one with God, and God lives in us, and we live in God. And yet at the same time, we are one with God, and yet we are distinct from God. Okay, and this image of the incandescent log, or John of the Cross uses another image of a window that starts out with a lot of dirt and grime, and so you get the water out, and those are the sacraments, and you get the soap out and you clean it. And if you're the window, you're saying, what are you doing? You're scratching me. No, we're cleaning you. So we clean off but even after I get it all wiped off with whatever means you want to use, prayer, fasting, sacraments, et cetera, now the window is completely clean, but the window is still not yet perfect. It's when the light shines through the window, and the window, as it were, John of the Cross says, and I don't think in those days they knew about non-reflective glass, but John of the Cross says, at a certain angle, the window actually disappears. You can't even tell that there's a window there. It looks all light. So again, you have this image of the inner penetration of a substance, a created substance, glass, a window, with the light. The light is greater than the window, but the window and the light are one. And the window is distinct from the light. And the window, I'd have to take the metaphor to another level if I said that, so I won't say that. So you get the point, though. The log and the window are one with that which they are plunged into, and yet they are distinct from it. And the process of getting to that incandescent place is a purgative one. It's an inevitably purgative one. So to use Mary Catherine's language, I'm so happy she's able to join us again after a long bout with COVID and lots of other commitments that she has. She's on the Zoom with us today. It's the difference between moving. Now we are created in spirit by the Spirit. So we are little, if you think of God as a consuming fire, we are little flames of the fire. Okay, and that's a little bit of a dangerous metaphor to use, because we are not exactly parts of God. It's not like in our creation we separate off from God. But when we are created by, and we were created by God before the foundation of the world, okay? So in our creation, in our conception by God as finite dwelling places for his own consuming fire, we become one with the fire, and that means that we are conceived in spirit. It is God who generates our being. And because he generates our being, we have no being in ourselves. We are nothing in ourselves. Here's another mysterious, mystical statement. We are nothing in ourselves, and yet we are something. We are something because the something that we are is a created gift of God. And because the gift is all of God, all of the gift is God. Because the gift is all of the gift is of God, all of the gift is God being present to the object and yet giving us a distinct identity and a distinct existence that belongs to both us and God. Does that make kind of mystical sense to you? You still following? Everything I have comes from God. So everything I am is of God. So there must be God in me. And for God to be in me must mean, in some sense, the fullness of God is in me. And yet I am not the fullness of God. I partake of the fullness of God. He shares his godness with me. That's what it means to be conceived in spirit, okay? Now, when we come into this world, we immediately begin to identify with and absorb and mimic, mirror the self-seeking behaviors and attitudes and dispositions that we find in this world. And we've talked in many gatherings of how did this world get in this state to begin with, and we're not going to revisit that right now. Let's just say right from the get-go, for the purposes of this gathering, the world is finite. It's a created something by God and of God and from God and with God. And yet it has somehow lost its conscious connection with God. The whole world has, okay? And we are born into that unconsciousness of our ontological dependence upon God. We think of ourselves as having been generated simply by our parents or by material causes of some kind. It never occurs to us that the whole shebang came from nowhere, the Big Bang, the whole shebang. So everything is beholden to God, but everything that is beholden to God, for the most part, has forgotten that it's beholden to God. And now it looks to its own self-interest, and there's nowhere that happens more in creation than within the human species. Okay, that's kind of making sense. So people are born into that, unaware of their intrinsic connection to God, and the behaviors and attitudes and personalities that we develop in that world of unconsciousness, the Bible calls sin. And psychologists sometimes call ego. People call it different things. Blindness, indolence, different words are used for it. We don't get it. We don't get the fact that we are not our own creators. We don't get the fact that every moment, our very existence is dependent on a love outside of ourselves. We don't get the fact that we are, in the essence of our being, oriented towards that love who created us. And our desire for love is the image of the one who created us, drawing us to himself. And in Christian universalism, that attraction to the one who created us for himself and for our perfect happiness in himself is so strong that no amount of ego that anyone has developed can finally prevent the divine magnet of God from pulling through the wall of ego, the person's created in spirit for himself. The spirit attracts the spirit. The spirit in God attracts the spirit in us with an irresistible force. Okay, now people have imagined that sin then can become the unmovable object, you know, the old dilemma, the irresistible force and the unmovable object. But if you think of sin as ego, it is a creation of a created entity, the human being. So anything that is created by definition is as nothing compared to the mystery of the uncreated love that created it in the first place. You may not be following that, but I am. Okay, so again, I'm kind of skirting Christian universalism here. I guess the main vision of Christian universalism is, well, St. Paul says it over and over and over again, and I don't have my main encourager to this on the Zoom today because Dorothy Berry is down with dental problems right now. I think she's in a lot of pain. And eye problems. I mean, at 97, I guess some of the equipment starts to go south.
Wow.
So, but St. Paul talks about all the time, what can separate us from the love of Christ? I am convinced that neither life nor death, powers nor principalities, whatever, you know, I should look it up in Romans 8. Nothing can separate us. In Isaiah today, we read from the passage of Isaiah, who had this same vision even before Christ came. Isaiah said, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall proclaim that God is Lord. St. Paul says the same thing in Ephesians. So if you look at Ephesians 1, Romans 5, and 1 Corinthians 15, plus many, many other passages, you can't overlook the universally salvific power of God's uncreated love unless you don't want to see it. And that was, in fact, in my view, that was why, well, John the Baptist, for example, today in the gospel, John the Baptist sends his apostles to Jesus saying, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? You can see there that John the Baptist could not comprehend how Jesus could be as merciful as he was. He could not get his arms around the trans-Israelite scope of Jesus' love. It was the very mercy of God. It was the very wideness of God's mercy that was a stumbling block for the Jews who wanted the world divided up into the saved and the unsaved. Now, having said all that, I want to come back to the original point of the chaff that's burning and the mug, the bowl that's put back together but retains the fault lines, and now they partake of glory, just like Christ's wounds in the resurrection partook of glory. I mention that because when I say that all will be saved and all will be well, St. Julian of Norwich, she had her famous phrase, all will be well, all manner of things will be well. God showed me that sin was as nothing compared to his love. So you have nothing to worry about. All will be well. Don't bother yourself about this stuff. And I sent some of you a link last week of another person who had a near-death experience, and he now spends his whole life. I actually arranged a Zoom call with him on Monday, so I'm going to be talking to him, but it's very affirmative of the same thing. He immediately, he didn't say this, but when he gave his witness, I immediately thought of St. Paul's line, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, never, nor has it ever entered the mind of any human being what God has prepared for those who love him. Now, those who are not universalists will say, yeah, see, only for those who love him. What about those who don't love him? They're not going to see that. And if you want to believe that, go ahead and believe it. I always ask people who don't want to be universalists, I always say to them, do you wish it were true? Do you wish that all those people who are going to hell could go to heaven? Well,
They deserve it.
they deserve it. I mean, otherwise it's not that's not fair if they do.
Yeah.
And when you think like that, if you just look at any of the parables of Jesus, really, but the one in particular of of the men who went out into the guy says, you go out in my vineyard and work for the day, and they go and they say, great. And then the ones come at the last hour, and then when it comes time for the pay, the ones in the last hour say, it's not fair. Those are the same kind of people who want other people to go to hell. And the line in that gospel is, are you envious because I am generous? And to me, all theories of eternal annihilation, I talked with a woman recently, and this was an argument, I think maybe even used by Thomas Aquinas. And it's so utterly insane that I can't, St. Thomas Aquinas, his metaphysics are perfect and his eschatology leaves a lot to be desired. But this woman says, well, and the people who have addressed this issue in the scholarly world have lots of counter arguments for this. But her argument was, I said, could you be happy? And I got to be careful of where I even raise this topic, because I'll either get reported to the Archbishop or people will go ballistic and they'll go on Twitter and say he's preaching heresy over there. But I said, what person? So it started out by saying, who are we as individuals? We are actually people who are in relationship with other people. So I have no identity apart from my relationship with my mother. A child doesn't know who they are. They don't kind of come out and say, here I am, I've got an ego, I'm ready to go. They mirror their mother, and over time they come to a sense of themselves. But I think if most of us are honest, we still can recognize in ourselves behaviors and attitudes that we have incorporated or internalized from other people. So much so that most people, what we call a midlife crisis is a person getting to a point in life and realizing, oh my God, I'm nothing than the opinions of others. I'm like a wind chime. I just blow with whatever. Who am I? And then that's when the spiritual journey actually starts. Okay, but even when I come into a deeper sense of my own true self, even when I come in to a deeper sense of my own personal vocation, even when I come into a sense of myself as not my mother's daughter, as not my father's son, as something more than that, something in my own right. Most people die without that ever happening, by the way, okay? And that's why you see the violence in the world. People just go from pillar to post because they have no internal filters to turn off getting entangled with other people. So they see somebody they don't like and they immediately react. There's no internal space in them to move from reaction to response. They don't have that internal breathing room. We've talked about how that gets developed on other gatherings, so I'm not going to talk too much about that today. But for people who do have a midlife crisis and do begin the spiritual life in earnest, not just repeating the platitudes that their parents taught them, not just repeating the same old prayers that they've said every day in and day out since they were little girls sitting. Most people's spirituality never gets beyond second grade. I was at a penance service this week at another parish, to go unnamed. And if I had to, well, I shouldn't, I have to go to confession after it was one, even the prayer service that had been developed. It was everything I could do not to get sick reading this thing. It was so full of cotton candy platitudes. And there's a whole building of parrots in there saying it together. Not parents, parrots. Yeah, Jesus, yeah, thank you. I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. It's all good. And I do have to go to confession now because I never know. So I'll just jump ahead for a minute. The guy who had the near-death experience, he came back and he was a congregational minister, and he said, coming back to religion in this world after having gotten a taste of the other world is like coming back into a cartoon. He said, this life is like a cartoon compared to that. Okay, so the saints are those who at some point in their life recognize that my religion is a cartoon, this world is a cartoon. It's all make-believe until you really come to the truth of who you are. I've just been a mirror reflection of the authority figures in my life till now. And actually, for a person like that, they can start to begin to see that the suffering they've experienced in their life is actually their true self trying to get out of the prison that they've been in their whole life. You know, my mother used to say, you don't know what to do with yourself, do you? And I said, no, I don't know what to do with myself. What I realized I was saying now, and I said that was like back when I was 5 years old. What I was really saying now is nothing you people are doing here makes any sense to me. I'm listening to a different music. I'm dancing to a different drummer, but I didn't know that. And there was enough in the religion that they gave me that seemed to satisfy the yearning of my heart, but I was always restless. Oh, our cell phones. Good try, Philip. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So where was I? There we are. Okay.
Religion is a cartoon and they always gave you just enough to keep your heart satisfied,
right.
but it
Okay.
wasn't what you were actually yearning for.
Yeah, so and actually everybody is yearning for more, but we've anesthetized ourselves with our religion, with our careers, with our goods. We've anesthetized ourselves to the divine restlessness that is implanted in us by the Spirit to move us through the ego into the life of the Spirit. Mary Catherine will like that. I'm hitting the bowl because that was a good one for you. So the Spirit is always at work. And so, of course, the powers of evil, such as they are and whatever they may be, they're also working to keep you anesthetized. They're working to keep you unconscious. They're working to keep you entangled in this web of lies and violence and cartoonish drama that everybody gets caught up and sells their soul to. Okay, but even that will not prevent you from entering the kingdom of God. It will make it a hell of a lot different. And I use that word advisedly. It will make it a hell of a lot different because all that falsehood has to be burned away. Okay, it has to be stripped from you. And it will happen. There's no way it cannot happen. Everybody who has these near-death experiences, every one of them talks in one form or another about a life review. Okay, and the life review is hell, but it's also heaven. And this is an important point, and I'm jumping a bit here to the near-death experience as an ancillary confirmation of what I'm saying as a way to try to illumine the meaning of Paul's writings and the gospel here that I'm preaching of Catholic Universalism. What did I just say? What am I using?
The Catholic University.
I'm using the near-death experience. Okay,
Oh,
and what the life reviews say is that you are shown in an instant. Of course, when you move over that threshold, you enter a timeless dimension. You also enter you are now your soul, not your body. You're looking at your body, but you are the real you. Here's the first thing that happens when people pop out of their bodies when the angel of death comes to take you to God, and you are your soul. And again, I'm making a composite picture of hundreds of near-death experiences that I've studied, some hokey, some genuine, okay, vis-a-vis the Gospels as I understand them. And what they have in common is that the soul is forcibly removed from the body. There is a resistance because the desire to preserve life is instinctual in us, but it's, as all those people say, to resist is futile. So don't try. See, whatever happens with God is futile. And these people who have near-death experiences and still say, if you believe in hell, you'll find out. You can argue about it all you want. I'm not going to disagree with anybody. You'll find out. They are so convinced that what they see is the true reality, and that this life is a cartoonish form of reality compared to real reality. I believe that completely. And I also believe that the fullness of life that we will immediately experience on the other side of our bodies separating from our souls, I also believe that fullness of life is accessible to us right now through contemplative prayer. I have no doubt about that at all. And everything in Christianity is aimed at enabling people to experience eternal life now, and to get through the life review now, and to get through the purgation now, and to let everything fall away now, and to be recreated now. That's the whole point of Jesus saying, if you listen to my words and believe in them, you have already passed from death to life. So Christ came into the world to save us from the hell that we are inevitably going, that every person ever created is inevitably going to go through, because the development of the ego is inevitable in this world of misdirection, of cartoonishness. Okay, and it's important to remind you that the cartoonishness of this world has nothing to do with the fact that it is created as a limited world. It's a finite creation, but being finite or being limited or being not God does not mean that I am imperfect. Let me say that again. Being finite and limited and being not God does not mean that I'm not created perfect. I am created perfect, but I'm not perfect. I'm perfect as God is perfect, but I am not as, let me see. I am perfect with the same kind of perfection that exists in its uncreated fullness in what we call God.
Wow.
There, you'll have to go back and listen.
Yeah.
It's meant to be deep. Okay, my only point here is we live in an imperfect world. We live in an egoic world, but the creation of the world was not the creation of the ego. The ego was a creation of finite people who, for some reason unknown to us and known only to God, which I think was allowed by God for the greater honor and glory of God. But the ego entered the world because finite creatures, for some reason, lost their intuitive grasp of their finiteness and God's infiniteness. And they started to mistake their own finite existence as absolute, and forgot that the absolute was what created them as images and likenesses of the absolute. So we are created with an absolute desire for love. We are created with an absolute desire for perfection, with an absolute desire for goodness and beauty and truth. All of those are different dimensions of what we call God. You have to stop trying to picture God as, because God can, if you can think of it, it's not God. The closest we have is Jesus. God is as Jesus does. You've heard me say that 1,000 times on the gathering, okay? So now, every person then will experience the destruction of the ego, because the absolute desire of the human person is implanted in us from the absolute God, who has an absolute desire for every person that he absolutely created. So those two forces, what stands between the person and perfect union with God is the ego. But the ego is an illusion. It's a deception. It's a lie. It does result in murder. It does result in hurt. It does result in damage. And in glory, when I'm gone through the ego, you will still see the wounds that the ego inflicted on you, but they will be signs of glory because of the one who has restored you to himself. So the gospel is all about restoring the shalom, the peace, the unity, the oneness of being that existed prior to the advent of the ego in this universe. There may be other universes where ego does not exist. And how our universe would connect with all those universes is, and some people say that in their near-death experiences see this kind of multi-universal beauty in God. And that gets beyond anything that is helpful to me in terms of the gospel. And it sounds a little hokey to me, but I just let it go. So, but so I was using the near-death experiences. Yeah. So the life review then, okay. And just one final thought about the life review. So it is hellish because, and with the guy I'm going to talk to on Monday in particular, I sent you his link last week. So I hope you watch him. And he's got several other YouTube videos that I've tuned into since then to get a better understanding of who he is, because he struck me as so authentic. And one of the things that he says repeatedly is that if you want a simple definition for ego, or you want a simple definition for sin, because it all boils down to this, is that persons hurt each other intentionally and unintentionally. Sin is the general hurt that the world experiences because people bump into each other as unconscious and unenlightened and unaware beings. It just is. And he said, when I was being shown all the ways in which I had caused hurt to people, he said, I felt the hurt that I caused them, and I felt it times 10,000. He said, however, at the same time, I felt that I was being loved through the whole thing. I was experiencing the hurt, but I was also experiencing the love of God, who was communicating to me something like, this is just what you human beings do to each other. And I understand it. And I have even allowed it because it can't take you away from me. So there was a comfort about even in the hell. And you know, the saints have said this about purgatory, that there is a joy, and I'm talking medieval versions of purgatory here, okay? Saint, what was the famous Saint, her name will come to me in a minute. She had the most famous visions of purgatory. Sorry, her name is escaping me. It'll come to me. Anyway, she said that there's a great joy, even though the pain is agonizing in purgatory, there's a great joy in knowing that I'm going to God. And that's the same thing in these near-death experiences. You're being shown things that that cause you great remorse. The remorse is the hell. But I'm also being held by God until the remorse is dissolved into this greater love that is with me. And one can imagine, you know, even though there's no time in eternity, one can imagine it taking a lot of time till I can get over the shame that I experienced by having been brought face to face with what I did to another person or to myself or to another. But the love that is holding me in it all is the consolation that allows me to get through the hell that I'm walking through to get through the ego. So when all of that remorsefulness is done, I am free. I'm free of the ego, and I go to God. So whether the process takes place on the other side of death or the process takes place on this side of death, the goal is the same. God is constantly at work restoring us to our original beauty in God and giving us an eternal share of the beauty and truth for which our whole hearts and souls are seeking and desire. I hope that's helpful.
So you can have the remorse before you die?
Yeah, of course.
And get rid of the shame before you?
Yes, ideally. So Gretchen's question is, so you get rid of the more remorse and shame and guilt before you die. Did you see who that is?
And how do you do that?
Yeah, so how do you do that?
Right.
Right. So the way you do it is the traditional ways that every religion has given to do it. You acknowledge it. You express a sincere desire not to do it, go down there again. You recognize that apart from God, that's all you will end up doing. So it's and so this reminds me of another important point. Our sins are permitted by God in our lives to cause us suffering and grief, so that we don't do them anymore. You know, I never smoked cigarettes, but my brother did. And my father caught him smoking cigarettes. So he said, oh, great. He said, you want to smoke? He says, here's the whole pack. Smoke them all. And you're not moving from here till you smoke them all. And he never smoked again in his whole life. Okay, so sin is permitted by, everything is permitted by God. St. Paul says this, all things work for good in the lives of those who love God. Now, of course, the annihilationists, the infernalists, I call them the infernalists, they say, see, not everybody loves God. No, everybody does love God, but they don't know it. They have misplaced their desire for infinite love in pornography or affairs or money or food or whatever it might be. And when you get enough packs of those cigarettes in your system, you grow sick and tired of what you thought was going to be your greatest satisfaction. So see, even sin is allowed by God to sicken us. Sin makes us sick. Now, the evil one knows how to fine-tune sin so it doesn't make us quite sick. It makes us sick, but we say, I'll quit tomorrow. And so the evil one always whispers things in our minds like, it's not that bad. You can call, she doesn't really need to know. What good would it do? Okay, so the call is always the same, to evacuate myself of my ego. The problem is I cannot evacuate myself of my ego any more than I can take tar off my hands by scraping the tar off my hands, right? I spread it. That's why St. Paul says, the good that I desire to do, I can't always. And the evil that I don't want to do, I do. Who will deliver me from this dilemma? So even trying to get rid of your sins in large part is an egoic project. And C.S. Lewis writes about this very beautifully in his book called The Screwtape Letters, when there's a guy who wants to reform his life and he's having an affair and he's drinking too much and he wants to get rid of the booze and he wants to get rid of the girlfriend, but he's having a hard time. And so the chief evil angel says to the evil angel who's in charge of this particular guy, because apparently we have evil angels tempting us just like we have guardian angels helping us. And I don't doubt that for a second. And he says to the angel who's been assigned to tempt this guy, he said, let him. He said, stop tempting him with the girlfriend. Stop tempting him with the alcohol. Take away those addictions. Let him get free. Because he's going to be so proud of himself, he'll be worse off than if he was boozing and whoring. And then he's got the worst of all sins, self-righteousness, which is the sin that is the most egoic. So this is where all these paradoxes come into play. Religion can be the not just the opiate of the people, but it can also be an illusion of grandeur that the evil one weaves around us. Look at, you're in the state of grace. Aren't you good today? Boy, aren't you something? So you cannot tell from the outside what's going on with a person on the inside. And religion can often be, it can be used by the liar and the deceiver. Religion can be used to reinforce your ego, and more often than not, it is. Remember the story in the Gospels, the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee said, I go to church every week, I tithe, I pray daily. Look at this poor sinner here. He doesn't do any of those things. And the sinner said, you're right, I don't do any of those things. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus says, I tell you, that one went home justified, meaning that one went home in right relationship with God. The other did not. So all the parables of Jesus are getting at these two states of docility to God and union with God. So metanoia, or repentance, means to turn away from the world of the ego and turn towards God. And, you know, the 12-step programs that are out there, they always follow the same formula that every religion has used to bring people in this life into a more perfect union with God. acknowledge your defects of character, acknowledge your transgressions, make amends to the extent that you are able, and leave the rest to God, and then be reborn. You start a new life. Every day is a new day. And it truly is a resurrection from the dead for people who follow that pattern, okay? But it's all dependent on a renewed recognition that I am not God. But in the depths of my being, I am created perfect by God. And that perfection is not of me, it's of God. And in that perfection lies my destiny, lies my true identity. One of the things that all these near-death experiences say repeatedly is, and I started to say, this is where I lost my thread of thought a minute ago, when my soul separates from my body, at least this one gentleman that I'll be talking on Monday says this very often. And I heard another Catholic woman, an older Catholic woman in her 70s who had a near-death experience, say exactly the same thing. She said, as soon as I came out of my body, I looked back at that person who was there and I said, finally, my true self. It was like I'm who I am. I'm truly who I am the first time now that I've been freed from this shell or instrument of my spirit. I wasn't able to see who I was when I was enmeshed with that, as one person said, that little bloody pile of meat down there because she was being cut open and having spine surgery done on her. So your soul, the traditional language of the soul, is the person that God knows of you, okay? Now, he also knows your body, and we've each been given a body to be the instrument of our soul. But our souls precede our bodies, and our bodies are given. Our souls have our bodies do not enclose our souls. Okay, so when the soul goes to God, when the person goes to God, the body is temporarily left behind. As Christians, we believe that it will ultimately be reunited in a glorified way by God in his kingdom. But it's possible before the soul separates from the body to separate from the ego. And then my body and my soul become the true person that I am. It's possible to live in this body as the true person, the perfect person that God created you to be. And when one is doing that, one is even aware that one is doing it. And in that state of awareness, one is also completely humble, even though they may sound egoic or egotistical. I'll illustrate the point. They said to Saint Teresa, Little Flower, on her deathbed, you've become a saint. And she said, I know it. Yeah, isn't it something? and that took everybody aback. Oh my God, is she more egotistical than we thought? And they said, well, how did you become a saint? She said, I can tell you very easily how it happened. She said, it was when I stopped trying to become a saint and realized the only one who's holy is God. And as soon as I made that recognition, I felt the holiness of God take possession of me, or maybe reactivate itself in me. Now, I'm paraphrasing Saint Teresa, but all the saints are generally characterized by a word in Greek that they call parrhesia. It means bold confidence. I knew a nun who was in perfect union with God, Sister Peter. There's her picture up there. She at certain times she would say, I'm just going to tell God to do this. And I said, where do you get that? She says, I get it from God.
Wow.
He's given me permission to tell him. And so when people are in union with God, they feel that familiar with the one who made them. And there's no pride in it at all. They feel privileged to be at the heart of the Trinity. And that's how each one of us is in God's self. But we don't realize that because our ego keeps us from being aware of how beloved we are. And I suppose in a certain sense, there's no way for us to be aware. I mean, there is, but it's so much easier if you do have one of these near-death experiences. I mean, people come back and they don't even want to be here. they have been exposed to a reality that this world has no words for, even though they put words to it. And they do come back. I think this guy that I'm talking to on Monday again, he goes all around, even though he was raised kind of a Catholic, he goes around to these, he's got a YouTube channel he calls No Church. And he says, I've lost my faith. He said, I come back, I don't need faith now. I know beyond, I don't need to believe in anything. I know. Why would I need to believe if I already know? I mean, there's no doubt.
Other than just identity in God,
You have a unique identity, yes. And I always equate that, as some of the saints did, I equate the identity that each of us has in God. I also equate it with what we are created by God to do. It doesn't necessarily mean what context we do it in. Like I was not created by God to be a priest. I was created by God to do what I'm doing right now. I do that better as a priest. I mean, the state of life, there are certain states of life that facilitate your unique calling better than others. And that should be the main criteria for the choice of a state of life. But who I am in that state of life is no two wives are the same. No two priests are the same. No two doctors are the same. Whatever I'm doing eludes what I define myself as. So I never want to put a label on myself, but I do want to try to discern what it is that I cannot not do. And if I can put some words on that or some images on that, at least I know who I am and I know what I'm all about. And because when I'm in touch with that and I'm doing what I'm called to do, what I'm created to do, what I cannot not do, when I'm doing that, I'm infinitely happy, even if it expends a lot of energy, even if I get tired at times. I never get burned out. I wrote to this guy and I said, if you're like me, I said, I see you giving these talks about your near-death experience every day somewhere. You're invited on a new show. And I said, I'm tempted to ask you if it ever gets tedious, but I suspect that it does not, because it's so overwhelming to you that every time you start talking about it. And he wrote me back, he said, you're exactly right. He said, every day it's fresh to me. Every day it's new to me. He says, I have no other desire than to tell people God is for real. You are for real. You are infinitely loved. Nothing can keep you from going to God. You can argue about it all you want. You can have all the theology you want. It's not going to make a whit of difference. You're going to have no choice about it. It's going to happen. You're going to go through whatever hell you need to go through to get there. And there's nothing to be afraid of. And so, now I always contend that's what the apostles experienced at Easter. I believe they had a near-death experience without having a near-death experience. They had it the near-death experience came to them, except the real death and resurrection experience came to them. Jesus appeared to them, and in their encounter with the risen Lord, they had exactly the same kind of out-of-this-world experience that people who have gone over to Jesus on the other side have had and then come back. In other words, the veil between these two worlds was dissolved. It can happen in a near-death experience, or it can happen in a resurrection appearance, or it can happen in contemplative prayer. Contemplative prayer is practicing death before death. That's what it is. And I really don't know, of all these things that I talk about on the gathering, I can see now my own focus getting narrower and narrower here about what I'm eventually called to do with people. We can talk about this stuff all you want, and I can get up out of a coma and talk about it again if you want. And I'm excited to talk about it if I can, but everything I'm saying is just a milder version of what that guy is saying when he's talking about the near-death experience. And it's a milder version of what the early witnesses to the church were saying. They were basically proclaiming, you have nothing to fear. Death does not exist. The man is risen from the dead, and you are in him, and he is in you. And once you realize that, your life will be changed forever. And people began to believe it and said, well, how do we do it? And then they would gather like this and it was spread by osmosis. So, but it was essentially an experience. Christianity is essentially an experience of God with us, Emmanuel, God with us. Now we say that at Christmas, and we've got it on Christmas cards, but how many people actually know how to get beyond the ego such that they experience God with them? How many people experience that they're living right now in the kingdom of God? Very, very few. So that's why religion is, and we're running out of ways to try to convince people. Fear doesn't work anymore with millennials. None of that stuff works anymore. In a culture that supported it, you could use fear as, you could use the stick. It's only the carrot now that's going to bring people forward. You have to give them a vision. That's why people are so attracted to UFOs and to near-death experiences. They want a taste of the supernatural. They want to meet somebody who tells them it's real. They don't want somebody who's just going to tell them, well, when you die, maybe something's going to happen and there's a calculus that you have to go through. It just becomes boring after a while. So really, the challenge of Christianity is how to continually refreshen our sense of the light of God. We talk about God as, I talk about God, the early church fathers talked about God as the uncreated light. Remember, Jesus said, I am light from light, God from God, we say in the creed, true God from true God. Think of God as an infinite source of light, and we are created as beings of light. Angels are also created as beings of light. They shine with a different kind of light than we shine up. But we are, on Christmas Eve, you see those nice candles within the houses, or they put those candles on the sidewalk sometime inside of a paper. That's how you want to think of yourself. I am a container for the light of God. And if you want to think of another image even further than that, think of, and this was an image the priest used at the penance service on Wednesday. I use it a lot with kids in penance services as well whenever I do them, and that's this. The priest, there was the Easter candle there, which represents the light of God, the light of Christ. And this man, this priest took, as I do when I do the same thing, he took a baptismal candle and he said, okay, he holds up the candle and there's no flame on it. It's just a candle with a wick. And he says, so this is what you look like before you're baptized. And then he puts the candle up and lights it from the Easter candle. And then the little candle has a light on it. Now the little candle says, see, now you're baptized and now you have the light of Christ in you. And as far as that goes, it's kind of nice. Another cell phone?
No. This is just a message.
Okay, messages. Okay. So then light of Christ. Okay. I think we're going to have so it's really my problem. I get when my train of concentration is broken, I fall out of the floor. So another image you could think of is, and that's true. And so sin, you can see sin. It's kind of like the wind comes along, blows out the candle. So we come to confession, we come back to the light of Christ and we relight it. And that's very true. I mean, people come to confession, they get the light relit. I guess the infernalists would say when the light goes out, that's mortal sin. When the light goes down, that's venial sin. And when the light shines bright, that's sanctifying grace. Yeah, if that works for you, great, go ahead, have it. I look at the human person like a light, but I believe that when you're created with the light of Christ. Okay, so forget the candle for a minute. Think of a pilot light or an inner light in your soul. Okay, in the deepest depths of your being, you and God are one. Your identity is there. You're perfect, the perfect person, the who that God created you to be is there, and you are all light, and you are partaking of the uncreated light of God. So you have light in your heart, like a pilot light in the depths of your soul. You have a pilot light, And that light comes from the uncreated light. Now, your light is created, but God's love is uncreated. But your light comes from his light. So it's one with his light, but it's not identical with his light. His light is greater than yours. Okay. And here's where I am, not where the priest on the penance service was. Just as God's created light never goes out because it's uncreated, your light, because it comes from God, also never goes out. Okay, but it gets covered over with ego, so it appears to have gone out. God is never not present to you as light within the depths of your being, and you are never not present to God as light in the depths of your being. What we call sin or ego keeps us from believing that, keeps us from seeing that, keeps us from feeling that. Okay, to the extent that by God's grace, I'm able, or the ego is removed from me, to the extent that the ego is removed from me, and to the extent that I practice, let's say for the sake of this gathering, to the extent that I practice my religion properly, and I negotiate my relations properly, but most importantly, that I learn how to pray contemplatively. When I do that, it's as if I turn the dial up on the pilot light in my soul, and I become filled with more and more light. Okay, so the more I can turn up the light in my soul to fill my being, the more the darkness in my life is banished. So rather than trying to pull out the darkness, which itself is nothing to begin with, except an absence of light, it's always better to turn up the light than to cast out the darkness. The light turned up dispels the darkness automatically. In other words, cultivating a life of contemplative prayer will make everything else in my life better. If I try to make everything else in my life better, but don't know how to pray properly, I might develop some pride because I'm happy about how much progress I've made in the moral life, but really I will have made very little progress at all. I'll still be pretty much encased in darkness, and the light will still be there, and I'll still be able to see it a little bit, but it won't burn brightly. I can't, better to light one candle than curse the darkness. We've always heard from the Christophers. My version of it is better to turn up the light and dispel the darkness than to worry too much about the darkness at all. Cultivate the light. Learn how to turn up the light. Or enter into the light on the other side and come back, and then the light, I don't know, even then the darkness remains to some extent, but a person is possessed of a vision of the light. So we have to know how to access the uncreated light of God, which is somehow present within us. We need to know how to get in touch with the presence of God within us if we are really to live a new life in this world. Otherwise, it'll all take place when our souls are separated from our body. And I think we'll all end up in the same place anyway. So again, but beyond that, I don't know much more, because none of the people who have been in the near-death experiences that I've listened to have actually gone through the final archway to light. So there is a dimension to the beatific vision that is not given even to those who have had the experience of the light calling them out of this world into them. So enough about near-death experiences.
I didn't get the link to that.
Oh, I'll send you the link to that, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of themes thrown together that we've talked about before as well. Yeah, again, I'm
I
tempted to.
think this makes a lot of sense.
Okay, good. Does that generate,
Explain
you
a lot more.
got to get up and go?
No, did we get the link?
I'm not sure.
But
Oh, I
this,
thought I
uh,
saw, okay,
I-
I'll send it again to
Yeah,
everybody.
send
on
it
the
again.
Okay.
I think I was checking, that's why. I
Any
know
other
it was
questions or observations?
Is humility more important than a lot of prayers? I mean, working on humility.
That's a good question. So the question is a lot of humility better than a lot of prayers? It all depends on how a person prays, because contemplative prayer and humility are identical.
Yeah.
And saying prayers, to me, I don't see a whole lot of upside to saying prayers. I don't say a lot. I mean, I say prayers, actually. I mean, I communicate in words to God. But prayer for me is wordless openness to God, interiorly, in a disciplined way, such that, I mean, the more you do it, the easier it is to access that same union with God outside the time of prayer. So the goal is to be able to practice prayer in such a way regularly in your life that when you're not in the time of prayer, you're still in the space that prayer brought you into, even though you're still trying to negotiate your way inside the cartoon here. In other words, outside of prayer, if you're a real contemplative, then you are walking in the cartoon world at every moment, aware that it's a cartoon. So you become like an angel, you know. G.K. Chesterton said, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. For a person who's in union with God, or for a person who's had this near-death experience that has been life-transforming, they don't worry one bit about what's going on in the world. It's utterly irrelevant to them. What everybody else has been out of shape about, the president, the Congress, the COVID, it means nothing to them. It doesn't mean that they don't move out of the way of traffic when it's coming at them. It doesn't mean they don't get their booster shot if they feel so inclined, but they could care less whether people die. See, once the fear of death is banished, so is the fear of life. Now, it doesn't mean, again, that you don't recognize danger, and that it doesn't mean that you're suicidal. If I know there's no death and I can't wait to get to the other side to see the fullness of what one is experiencing in contemplative prayer, it doesn't mean I'm going to take my own life today. And why not? The reason is that anybody who's had an encounter with God, or the infinite love, or the uncreated light, anyone who's had that experience has a need to share that experience. And the people who are sent back so that they can share the light. And again, God's purpose in all of this is to enlighten us before we die. Everything with God is to push the awakening process, the enlightenment process, the salvation process, the restoration to wholeness process, the rediscovery of our original goodness, the rediscovery of our belovedness by God and our uniqueness in God and our created mission by God, our sealed orders from God. All of that is being pushed by God continually so that we appropriate it, so that we benefit from it, so that we enjoy it sooner rather than later. Everything about God is about goodness now.
But your friend.
And the ego wants to, the deceiver wants to delay all that in the futile hope that he can delay it forever. He can't delay it forever. And he's, okay.
Your friend is like a messenger.
Yeah, your friend is like a messenger. This guy who goes around to all these churches, first thing he says, anybody else here had a near-death experience? All kinds of hands go up. He says, we've reached a point in our culture where it's no longer a shameful thing to say, I've done that. And I'm convinced that in large part, millennials who want nothing to do with that church over there will hear something from some of these people who've been on the other side. And what if they go wacky for a while? Who the hell cares? They are being put in touch with what these churches are trying to point to in the first place, the uncreated, infinite love of God. The problem is most churches don't believe in the infinite, uncreated love of God. They still believe that God either can't bring everybody to heaven because creatures can prevent them through the misuse of their freedom, or they believe he doesn't want to bring everybody to heaven because he's only chosen the elect for his kingdom. It's utterly insane. But Thomas Aquinas believed that. St. Augustine believed that. Robert Barron believes a milder version of that. Robert Barron says, if you ask me, I hope all people will be saved, but I can't say for sure because I'm not God. Well, that's a nice little gesture of humility. But yeah, I mean, well, anyway, I'm not going to go into all the kind of counter arguments for that. So his is kind of a guarded universalism. I hope so. There's a good reason to believe so, but we don't want to get too radical here and say we know so. And I guess in a certain sense, you can't ultimately say you know so, but I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, I can't see a scriptural or philosophical reason not to believe it. So I do believe it. So anyway, whatever the future is going to be, this uncreated light of God is going to continue to touch people. How he'll use his church as an instrument of that, how he'll use nature as an instrument of that, how he'll use UFOs as an instrument of that, how he'll use near-death. God, when you go to the other side, or if you really know God, you know that all of our ideas of God are cartoons. So to think that we can tell God anything about how God's going to operate or guess what he's going to do next, or figure out how, but what we can know about God through all these death experiences, as well as our own faith, what we can know for God is that God desires the good in every moment for every person. God is infinite goodness. But see, most people don't believe that. They believe God has a dark side, that at some point he's going to get you, or his patience is going to run out, or his love. It's God, Father, aren't there God's justice? What about God's justice and God's mercy? And I say God's justice and God's mercy are the same. This guy who went on the other side, he said, we talk about God's goodness, God's beauty, God's love, God's truth. He said they're all the same thing. They're one thing. And people are not annihilated in the face of God. The ego is annihilated in the face of God. People are set free. People are set free from their ego. So if Jesus was an incarnation of God's setting freeness, I see Jesus as a condensed form of God's uncreated light. So let's go back to that scripture in Hebrews. God is a consuming fire, okay? And when we come out of this life, we go into the consuming fire. And like the log in the fire that I talked about earlier, but in a much more instantaneous way, we're like the bug in the zapper. But what gets zapped is not the bug. The ego is what gets zapped. Is it painful? Yeah. Feels like, hurts like hell. Good, there you have your word. Hurts like hell. But the bug is not destroyed because you're not a bug. You're the beloved of God. What is destroyed are all the deceptions and lies and murderous ways that the evil angels have persuaded you to adopt unconsciously. That's why Jesus says, zap them, Father, for they know not what they do. In other words, forgive them, cleanse them of this ego. They didn't even know what they were doing when they were developing it. Had they known, as St. Paul says, had they known, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. So think of Jesus as so if God is the uncreated light and God is the divine zapper to whom all moths and butterflies and human persons' souls fly when they are released from the body. And if our initial encounter with God is more or less hellish, more or less purgatorial, more or less painful, the end result is divine bliss. Wow, that's good. It's divine bliss, and it happens almost instantaneously. I mean, there is the life review and there is the stripping of the shame and guilt, but nothing is like in this world. It doesn't take 1,000 years. Just like that. Everything is understood, everything is forgiven, everything is burned away, and yet the marks of everything remain in glory. It's so beautiful. You'd almost sound like I've been there. It almost sounds like I've been. So
I
no, there's one more point here now. Oh, so what about us here? What about our? So that's what happens on the other side, okay? And it happens to everybody on the other side. What about us here? Christ comes into the world as an incarnated form of the divine zapper. Okay, you know how the zapper is a light, you know, a fluorescent, extremely brilliant light. Christ is that same light, light from light, God from God. Christ is the same consuming fire as his Father, but in a form and with a frequency and in a modulation that we are able to accept without being annihilated in this life. He comes and tries to change us gently, whereas the consuming fire changes us dramatically. Okay, and what he's saying is, accustom yourself to the light now. Turn up the light in your own heart now, and your transition will be as if you're not even dying. St. John of the Cross says, when the deified person, when the saint whose light is completely burning, the log that is incandescent with the fire, when that person dies, they don't even know the difference between waking and living. Now they're seeing the fullness of something they've already known. Death just kind of dissolves. The veil between this life and the other life becomes so thin that it's like a flash fried spinach. It melts in your mouth, you know, just like cotton candy. It just, you know, and so the veil between this world but the veil of deception is still woven over the whole human race. So it's only those who have been taken beyond the veil, whether in contemplative prayer or near-death experiences, who can come back and try to awaken the others, that they can shed the deceptions right now if they want. They can awaken right now if they want. They can experience divine bliss at this moment if they want. So the whole Christian life is meant to be a life of divine bliss, because that's what the hereafter is.
The scriptures are full of fear. Everywhere I look there.
That's why I got meeting.
So Joe says, yeah, Cheryl, I see you. So Joe says the scriptures are full of fear. And I would say the scriptures are written by people who were still filled with fear. Okay, so they pictured God after the fashion of their own understanding of God. Now, you can see a progressive movement away from that as you move through Old Testament into the New Testament. But even if you look at the Synoptic Gospels, and we got to tie this up here in a minute, but if you look at the Synoptic Gospels, John understood the mystical meaning of Jesus better than even the other Synoptic evangelists. You can see them even picturing themselves as not understanding who Jesus is. Okay, so John understood Jesus better than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Paul understood Jesus better than John. The early church fathers understood Jesus better than Paul. So the trajectory of our understanding of God as infinite love is incarnate in Christ, but the grasp of that and the effects of that on the world are still in their very infancy stages. And most of us will die and experience the truth of what God is trying to do in history right now. And how that is and why God allowed this to be is known only to God. But you can be sure that it's all for some further dimension of goodness and glory that we're not able to grasp when we mentally struggle over it, because our minds are not equivalent to grasp. We shouldn't even raise these questions. We should just go towards the light and realize we are light from light, God from God, true God God became man so man could become God. We are one with God. I'm not going to go through all that again, but we are gods with a small g, G-O-D-S. We are gods in God. We are lights in the light, and the light is in the uncreated light. Everything is light. Even the beasts are light. They're filled with the light of God in a way that is appropriate to that species. So with that, we're going to quit for the day because we're at our quitting time. I'm glad we got started here anyway. I wondered how we were going to go, but it always seems to turn out okay. Let's finish with the glory be, and then I'll hang around for other questions if there are some. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you, Father.
There is